Quinn sat at the dinner table, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as her mother casually dropped the bombshell. "We used your college fund for Lisa's wedding," she said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Her father nodded, adding, "It was the best decision for the family." Quinn felt the weight of years of hard work and sacrifice crash down on her. Every late-night study session, every scholarship application, every hope she had built for her future, it all meant nothing to them. Lisa beamed, oblivious. "It's going to be the most beautiful wedding ever," she said, showing off pictures of an expensive dress, a grand venue, and a honeymoon in Paris. Quinn swallowed hard, keeping her face still. They expected her to accept it, to nod and say she understood. But inside, something shifted. A quiet, cold determination settled in her chest. She wouldn't fight them, not yet. Let them think they had won. That night she heard a soft knock on her door. It was Grandpa. He stood there, silent for a moment, before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He sat on the edge of her bed, his old hands clasped together. "I knew they would do this," he said quietly. "That's why I made my own plans." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "Inside this is a key and an address," he continued. "Go there when the time is right." Quinn stared at him, confused. "What is this?" she whispered. Grandpa simply patted her hand. "Your future," he said, "not theirs." Then he left, as if nothing had happened. Quinn held the envelope in her hands for a long time, feeling the paper between her fingers. She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let them take everything from her. Over the next few weeks, she watched as her parents threw themselves into Lisa's wedding preparations. They spent thousands on decorations, invitations, a luxury venue. Lisa acted like a queen, soaking in all the attention. "You'll still be there, right?" she asked Quinn one evening, flashing a fake, sympathetic smile. "I mean, I know this must be hard for you, but family comes first." Quinn smiled back, just as fake. "Of course," she said. Let Lisa enjoy her moment. Let her believe Quinn was the helpless, forgotten little sister. The more they underestimated her, the better. The night before the wedding, Quinn quietly slipped out of the house and followed the address Grandpa had given her. She arrived at a small bank, her heart pounding as she walked up to the teller. She handed over the key. "My grandfather left something for me," she said. The woman nodded and led her to a back room. A metal safe sat there, untouched. When Quinn opened it, her breath caught. Inside were stacks of documents, bank statements, and a letter from Grandpa. "I saw this coming," the letter read. "I saved for you. They can't touch this money. It's legally yours." Quinn covered her mouth, her hands shaking. It was all there, more than she could have imagined. Not just money for college, but enough to start fresh. A future they had tried to steal from her, now locked safely in her name. She felt something inside her shift again. This wasn't just about getting what was hers. This was about making sure they realized exactly what they had lost. The wedding day arrived in full spectacle. Lisa twirled in her designer gown, surrounded by guests marveling at the extravagant decorations. Their parents beamed with pride, shaking hands, soaking in the admiration. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. A manager approached her father, whispering something in his ear. His face turned pale. Her mother's smile faltered as he grabbed her arm, speaking urgently. Lisa frowned. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp. Then the news spread like wildfire. The final payment for the venue had bounced. The catering company refused to serve food until the check cleared. The luxury honeymoon suite had been canceled due to a declined card. Whispers ran through the crowd. Didn't they plan this properly? How could this happen? Lisa turned to her parents, panic setting in. "Fix it!" she hissed. Quinn stood near the back, watching it all unfold. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't needed to. The moment her parents decided to gamble everything on Lisa's wedding, they had set themselves up for failure. Grandpa had simply withdrawn his silent support, letting them crumble under the weight of their own choices. Lisa's voice rose, nearly hysterical now. "You promised everything was covered. What do you mean we don't have the money? Their father pulled out his phone, desperately trying to call the bank. Their mother clutched her pearls, shaking her head. There must be some mistake, she muttered. But it wasn't a mistake. It was reality, finally catching up with them. Quinn walked up to them, her steps slow, measured. Her father turned to her, desperation in his eyes. You have to help, Quinn. We'll pay you back. We just need... She tilted her head, pretending to consider it. Then she smiled, the same polite, hollow smile they had given her when they stole her future. I would, she said softly, but I have a flight to catch. Lisa's mouth fell open. What? Quinn reached into her bag and pulled out her own set of tickets. First class, one way, fully paid. Grandpa saved for me, she said simply. I'm going to college. The realization hit them all at once. While they had been planning Lisa's wedding, Quinn had been planning her escape. While they had spent every cent they had, she had been securing a future beyond their reach. Her father sputtered, but... Quinn raised a hand, stopping him. No, she said. You made your choice. Now you live with it. Lisa looked like she wanted to scream. Their mother opened her mouth, but found nothing to say. The crowd was still murmuring, the guests now fully aware that the wedding had turned into a financial disaster. Quinn turned on her heel and walked away, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She wasn't just leaving behind a family that had betrayed her. She was walking toward a life they could never touch. At the airport, she read Grandpa's letter again. Some people win battles by fighting, others win by being prepared. Quinn smiled, folding the letter carefully. She had spent years believing she was the forgotten child, the one left behind. But in the end, she was the one who had truly won. Quinn's flight soared through the sky, the city below shrinking into the distance. She leaned back in her seat, letting out a slow breath. It was over. The weight of years of being overlooked, of sacrificing, of being the less important daughter, it was gone. The only thing ahead of her now was her future. She pulled out her phone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls and unread messages from her parents and Lisa. They were all the same. Mom, Quinn, we need to talk. You can't just leave like this. Dad, you're being unreasonable. We'll figure something out if you just help us fix this. Lisa, you're seriously going to let my wedding be ruined over some stupid college fund? You're so selfish. Quinn stared at the last message, shaking her head. Selfish. That was the word they always used when she didn't bend to their will. They had stolen from her, lied to her, expected her to give up her dreams for Lisa, and yet she was the selfish one? She deleted the messages without responding. There was nothing left to say. A few hours later, she landed in a new city, stepping into the crisp air of her new life. Grandpa had arranged everything, a small apartment near campus, tuition paid, even a little extra for her to start fresh. He had thought of everything. She called him the moment she settled in. I made it, she said, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. Grandpa chuckled on the other end. I never had a doubt, kiddo. How's it feel? Quinn looked around, a slow smile spreading across her face. It feels like freedom. For the next few weeks, she threw herself into her studies, finally focusing on her dreams without her family's shadow looming over her. She made friends, explored the city, built a life of her own. And yet, the messages kept coming. Her parents, Lisa, even extended family, some scolding her, some pretending to be concerned, some outright begging her to come back. She ignored them all. Then, one day, her phone rang with a familiar number. It was her grandfather again, but something in his voice was different this time. They're falling apart, Quinn, he said. Your parents are drowning in debt. They maxed out every card, took out loans they couldn't pay back. The wedding cost them more than they could afford, and now they're paying the price. Quinn closed her eyes, feeling no satisfaction, only inevitability. Lisa, she asked. She's furious, blaming them for everything. The husband's family isn't happy either. Turns out they didn't want their son marrying into a family with financial ruin hanging over their heads. Quinn exhaled slowly. So they lost everything? Everything but their pride, Grandpa said. They still won't admit they were wrong. They still think you should have helped them. Quinn laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course they do. Grandpa was quiet for a moment. They'll try to reach out again, Quinn, but you don't owe them anything. Don't forget that. I won't, she said firmly. Days turned into weeks, and Quinn continued to thrive. She aced her classes, made plans for her future, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was where she was meant to be. Then, one evening, as she was leaving a lecture, she saw an email from her father. Unlike the desperate, demanding messages from before, this one was short. Quinn, we lost the house. Your mother is struggling. Lisa barely speaks to us. I know you probably hate us, but we could really use your help. Please, at least talk to your mother. Quinn read it twice, her grip tightening around her phone. The house, the one they had used as collateral for Lisa's wedding loans, the one she had grown up in, gone. A part of her wanted to feel sympathy, to feel something, but she didn't. Instead, she thought about every moment they had made her feel like she was nothing. Every time they put Lisa first, every time they dismissed her hard work, every time they expected her to be grateful for their scraps. They had taken her future for granted, assuming she would always be there to help clean up their mess. But she wasn't that person anymore. Quinn typed out a response, short and final. I don't hate you, but you made your choices. Now live with them. Then she hit send and walked away, never looking back. Months passed, and with each passing day, Quinn felt lighter. She no longer checked her phone, expecting messages from her parents. She no longer carried the weight of their betrayal. Her days were filled with new experiences, real friendships, and the joy of living life on her own terms. The money Grandpa had set aside gave her the security to focus on her studies, but Quinn wasn't the type to rely on handouts, not even from the one person who had truly cared for her. She took on a part-time job at a local bookstore, not because she had to, but because she wanted to build something for herself. Every dollar she earned felt like another step toward the life she had been denied for so long. One evening, after closing up at work, she saw a familiar name pop up on her phone, Lisa. Not a call, not a long-winded text full of accusations, just a single message. I messed up. Quinn stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. 1,000 responses ran through her mind, but she simply locked her phone and put it away. Lisa had always expected Quinn to clean up her messes. This time she could sit in the mess she had made. Days later, she heard from Grandpa again. Lisa's husband left her, he said, his voice carrying none of the usual warmth. His family pressured him into an annulment, said she came with too much baggage. Quinn didn't feel sorry for her. Lisa had gotten everything she wanted, until she didn't. Now she had to face the consequences of living in a world that had revolved around her for too long. What about Mom and Dad? She asked. Barely keeping their heads above water, they had to sell off most of their stuff. They moved into some rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. Quinn could picture it perfectly. Her once proud mother, who had bragged about Lisa's perfect wedding, now forced to live in the reality she had created. Her father, who had dismissed Quinn's future as an afterthought, now watching his world crumble. They had placed all their bets on Lisa, believing she was their golden child, the one who would bring them success and security. And now they had nothing. You know, Grandpa continued, your mother still blames me for not helping them. Quinn let out a breath, shaking her head. Of course she does. She says if I had stepped in, they wouldn't be in this mess. If I had paid off their debts, Lisa would still be married. If I had helped, they wouldn't have lost everything. He sighed. They still don't get it, Quinn. They don't see that they did this to themselves. Quinn felt no anger, no sadness, no regret. She had spent too many years trying to prove her worth to people who never saw it. Now she had nothing left to prove. Do you want to see them? Grandpa asked, after a long pause. Quinn thought about it, thought about facing them, seeing the broken versions of the people who had once dismissed her dreams. She imagined her mother's defeated face, her father's hollow apologies, Lisa's desperate attempts to reconnect. No, she said finally, They're not part of my life anymore. Grandpa chuckled softly. Good answer. As she hung up, Quinn looked out at the city skyline, feeling the quiet strength inside her. She had walked away from them, from the pain, from the betrayal, and in doing so, she had found something even greater than revenge. She had found peace. A year had passed since Quinn had last spoken to her family. The silence wasn't lonely, it was freeing. She had built something real for herself, something they could never take away. Her studies were going well. Her job at the bookstore had turned into a managerial role, and she had started investing the extra money Grandpa had given her, just as he had taught her. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Quinn's fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, she considered responding. She considered telling them exactly what it felt like when they had stolen from her, how it felt to watch them throw away her future like it was nothing. But then, she simply deleted the message. She owed them nothing. That night, as she sat on her small apartment balcony, looking over the city she had built her life in, she felt no guilt, no sadness, no anger, only peace. Her mother and father had made their choices. Now they had to live with them. And Quinn? She had finally, truly moved on. A year passed, and Quinn hardly thought about her family anymore. Life had taken on a steady rhythm, one that belonged entirely to her. She had graduated with honors, secured a high-paying job, and was already saving for a future her parents had never imagined for her. The bookstore job had turned into an investment. She had partnered with the owner and helped turn it into a thriving business. Grandpa's lessons had served her well. She was careful, strategic, always thinking ahead. Then one day, she received an unexpected visitor. Grandpa. She hadn't seen him in months, though they spoke regularly on the phone. He looked older, a little more tired, but his eyes still held that sharpness she admired so much. He sat across from her at the small cafe where they always met, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. They lost everything, he said after a moment. Quinn already knew that. She had heard from distant relatives that her parents were now living in a small, run-down rental, struggling to make ends meet. Lisa had taken on multiple jobs, barely scraping by. Her father was unemployed. Her mother had aged faster than time should have allowed. They never learned, Quinn said simply. Grandpa sighed. No, they didn't. There was a long pause before he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Your mother called me again, Quinn exhaled, unsurprised. She said they understand now, that they regret everything, that they wish they had treated you differently. Grandpa shook his head. It took losing everything for them to see what they did to you. Quinn sipped her coffee, letting the words sink in. Maybe they did regret it. Maybe they finally understood. But regret didn't erase the past. Understanding didn't undo years of dismissal and betrayal. She asked if you'd see them, Grandpa said finally. Quinn looked at him, her gaze steady. What do you think? Grandpa studied her for a moment before nodding. I think you already know your answer. And she did. She had spent years chasing their approval, hoping they would see her, value her, love her. She had spent sleepless nights wondering why she wasn't enough for them. But now, sitting here, with her future bright and her past behind her, she realized something important. She didn't need their apology. She didn't need their validation. She had become everything they never believed she could be. Not because of them, but in spite of them. So she shook her head and smiled. Let them live with their choices. Grandpa smiled back, lifting his teacup in a silent toast. That's my girl. Quinn left the cafe that day feeling lighter than she ever had before. She didn't feel bitterness, or anger, or even sadness. Only freedom. She was done waiting for them to realize her worth. She had known it all along. Months passed, and Quinn continued to build the life she had once thought was out of reach. She had started her own business, something she never could have imagined back when she was just the forgotten daughter in her family's shadow. It was a small startup, focused on financial consulting, helping young adults avoid the kind of mistakes that had ruined her parents. She had learned from their failures, and now she was turning that knowledge into success. One afternoon, as she was finalizing a deal with a new client, a notification popped up on her phone. A voicemail from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but curiosity got the best of her. Pressing play, she heard a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Quinn, it's Mom." A long pause. "I don't know if you'll even listen to this, but I don't know what else to do. Your father is sick. It's bad. He asks about you. He says he's sorry. I know we don't deserve it, but please, Quinn, just come see him." Silence followed. Quinn sat still, phone in hand, mind racing. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. Her father, the man who had dismissed her future as if it were nothing, the man who had laughed as they drained her college fund for Lisa's wedding, the man who had never once admitted he was wrong. Now, at his weakest, he was asking for her. Or maybe he was only asking because he had nothing left. She stared at the screen, debating whether to delete the voicemail or call back. For a long time, she just sat there, weighing everything. Finally, she made a decision. That evening, she called Grandpa. "I got a message from Mom," she said. Grandpa sighed, as if he had been expecting this. "I figured they'd reach out eventually. He's sick." There was a long silence. Then, finally, Grandpa spoke. "What do you want to do?" Quinn leaned against the window, looking out at the city lights. The world she had built for herself was here, in front of her. The past was behind her, where it belonged. She exhaled. I just want to move on." Grandpa didn't question her, didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just nodded, his voice warm with approval. "Then do that, Quinn. You don't owe them anything." She had spent too much of her life waiting for them to see her, waiting for them to love her the way she deserved. But now, she knew the truth. Some people only realize what they had when it's too late, and some people walk away before they can be pulled back in. Quinn pressed delete on the voicemail. She had already chosen her future. She wasn't going back. Years passed, and Quinn's life flourished in ways she never could have imagined. Her business thrived, growing from a small startup into a well-known consulting firm. She had helped hundreds of people, young professionals, struggling families, dreamers who wanted to secure their futures the way she had once fought to secure hers. She had built something real, something lasting, something that was entirely hers. She never heard from her parents again. After she deleted that voicemail, there were no more calls, no more messages. Grandpa had mentioned once that her father's health declined further, and eventually he was gone. But Quinn never went back. She never visited, never reached out. She had mourned the loss of a family she never truly had long before they faded from her life. Lisa, on the other hand, had tried again. Years after their last conversation, she sent one final message. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted to say, I hope you're happy. You deserve to be." For the first time, Quinn didn't feel the sting of the past when she read Lisa's words. She didn't feel anger or resentment, just quiet acceptance. She didn't respond, not because she was still holding a grudge, but because she no longer needed anything from Lisa, closure, validation, apologies. She had found everything she needed within herself. One afternoon, she met Grandpa for lunch, as they had done so many times over the years. He was older now, moving a little slower, but his sharp wit and warmth hadn't faded. As they sat together, he looked at her with a proud smile. "You did it, kid," he said. Quinn raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" Grandpa chuckled. "Everything they said you couldn't. You built your life, you proved them wrong, and most importantly, you did it without them." Quinn smiled, looking out at the city that had become her home. He was right. She had done it, not for revenge, not to prove a point, but because she had finally realized her own worth. Her past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. And in the end, the best revenge wasn't watching them fall. It was rising so high that their absence no longer mattered.